That's interesting. The broadcast is now live. So what are we doing here? My
Good
God, it's the
question.
three of us. It's the three of us again.
The
So
gang is
there's
back
the
together.
gang is back together.
The
There's
band.
there's Prashant um, from People's Dispatch. There's Zoe from People's Dispatch, and it's me, Vijay from Globetrotter. And well, we're back. This is Give the People What They Want. We're thrilled to be back with you. It's been a big week in the People's Republic of China because they've been celebrating the abolishment, whatever word you want to use, the end of absolute poverty. Between 1949 and the present, 850 million people have lifted themselves up from poverty. In the last year of the pandemic, in fact, perhaps up to 80 million people have walked out of poverty. This meant, of course, a lot of social changes, education, health. It's a multi-dimensional approach to ending poverty. These were not done through cash transfers. This is not just about income and so on. It's multidimensional. What Amartya Sen and others have called a multidimensional way to understand poverty. So salutes to the Chinese people for doing this, and we really look forward to some of the experiences of the Chinese influencing other poor countries. Meanwhile, of course, guys, look, United States of America, please abolish hunger and poverty rather than these old shenanigans. Decided to bomb a so-called camp of so-called Iranian-backed militias. A lot of so-called, because nothing is really clear about who they struck on the Syria-Iraq border. It's true that over the course of these last few weeks, there have been some rocket attacks on the Erbil airport. That's all true. That's documented and so on. In fact, the press secretary, who's on record in 2017 against strikes on Syrian soil, she said it's a violation of Syrian sovereignty. As recently as a few weeks ago, she cautioned that there cannot be any retaliation, escalation, things have to be precise and so on. And then you get Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, a man with big stock holdings at Raytheon and so on, the defense secretary who used to be in the military himself, Lloyd Austin making a statement. I mean, guys, this is from CNN, okay? This is not from any sources behind the scenes or anything. This is CNN. Lloyd Austin just says, well, we're confident. We're not certain. We're confident that these are the people that conducted those strikes. So what is the margin of confidence? President Joe Biden himself apparently authorized the strike. So it's not some random, thing. He himself said, let's hit them. For what, President Biden? Retaliation against the attacks in Erbil. Okay, that's one thing. You have no proof, not submitted to anybody. You're striking Syrian soil. You don't want any escalation because they say, after all, that there shouldn't be any escalation from another Iranian-backed militia. Last time the US struck in Syria, there were protests at the Green Zone. I think it's important to tell people that the United States doesn't actually have authorization to have troops in Iraq. I mean, there is no authorization. They have troop presence in Iraq. And they said they did this strike is a defensive move. Now, I'm not sure if geography is the strong suit of everybody, but United States of America is far away from the Syria-Iraq borders. So defensive in what case? How are these fellows in Qatar, this, that, or the other, going to attack the United States? In fact, you're not even clear they attacked the Erbil airport. But anyway, this is the world we live in. On the one side, we have a serious attempt to end poverty and hunger. On the other side, we have this random press release, from the U.S. State Department and Defense Department, which is printed verbatim, in the world media, including, of course, CNN, which I read almost forensically. I thought the CNN story was more interesting than Jen Prisger, the press secretary's statement, because it was basically the same thing. So there it is. That's where we are. Meanwhile, of course, south of Iraq and Syria, where there's a kind of miserable, festering politics. South of that, we've seen, a series of strikes, but right through the African continent. But there was a significant strike in South Africa. Prashant, you want to walk us through the strike in South Africa?
Right. So we're talking, of course, about the general strike that took place
in South Africa on February 24th, and that's Wednesday. And this was called by the South African Federation of Trade Unions, one of the biggest confederations of trade unions in the country. It itself has around 800,000 members. And what was interesting about the strike, of course, was that the number of participants far exceeded that, probably somewhere in the millions, at least according to the union's call. And I think this is one of those strikes that we sort of globally need to pay attention to also, because South Africa, in that sense, has been one of the poster countries for how what we call neoliberalism has completely devastated the economy. So, what we see is, of course, even the official numbers say that in 2020 alone, over nearly close to 1.5 million jobs have been lost in the country. And say there's a huge economic crisis, the number of economically inactive people is, of course, much, much more higher, probably close to around 5 million or something. And despite all this, the government's say spending, the government's efforts to actually address this issue have been really, really poor. And like I said, this is common to so many countries. This is common to, for instance, India. This is common to Brazil. This is common to the United States. Across the world, we have seen all these countries, not pursue any serious efforts at increasing spending to alleviate any kind of the alleviate the impact of the pandemic, and instead continuing often with the same kind of austerity politics. And again, in a common theme, continuing with the attack on unions also, which is one of the things SAF to actually emphasize that during this period, what we've seen is, say, big business in collusion with the government attacking the unions, using this as an opportunity to actually, say, fire large amounts of workers. And these plans were always there. These plans were not something new. So we've seen last year in South African Airways, we saw a massive action by the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa and other unions to stop firing. We've seen the same thing in the power utility company Eskom, where again there's a huge possibility of a large number of loss of jobs. And what we're seeing is basically that this has been, and of course we talked about this earlier, this has been the time when millionaires and billionaires have actually increased their wealth, while the workers have actually been, moving further and further towards the kind of poverty we talked about earlier. So SAFTU strike that way was very significant because, it raised many of these demands. It raised the demand for a minimum wage, a basic income grant, a minimum wage of at least 12,500 rands, which is around $854. And also it raised the demand, for instance, for cutting down the bonuses of, say, the leaders of big business as part of a wealth tax, the money which would then go into, say, providing for those who are actually bearing the brunt of the pandemic. It raised other demands, including a moratorium on job losses and evictions. So, all in all, a very powerful strike. There was repression in Cape Town. Some union leaders were arrested, and the bulk of the workers stayed away. But as per the plan, because there's still a lockdown going on, there were, of course, demonstrations that took place. The workers coming out across the country, staging demonstrations, even within the limitations imposed by the pandemic. And this, in some senses, is also, you can also see it in the context of another strike which took place last year, that's in October. And that strike was called by COSATU, which is the Confederation of South African Trade Unions, a traditional ally of the ruling African National Congress. And at that point, the October strike saw COSATU and SAFTU working together. So that was actually a very good precedent for trade unions coming together, workers uniting in support of these demands, workers increasingly realizing and mobilizing on the understanding that the government has completely sold out and failed. And this strike again was supported, of course. COSATU endorsed it, and there is a possibility that as time passes, there is going to be probably more unity around some of these issues. Last week we talked about the death of some workers, three workers in South Africa in an accident, and I think that there's been, at least at People's Dispatch, we've been trying to sort of, draw the kind of link, a link that connects many of these workers' issues in the country, where there is, on the one hand, a very strong abandonment of the role of the government, and on the other hand, a very powerful mobilization by workers against these causes. So I think a lot of these things are very interesting to look forward to and watch, also because there is a very similar pattern going on, like I said, in many other countries, especially in some of the bigger economies, India, the United States, Brazil, definitely. All these places also very similar mobilizations taking place. So yeah.
I mean, Prashad, you're sitting in Delhi, where, of course, the farmers' protest continues. It's now what? November, December, January, February. We are now 3 months into it. Fourth month beginning, started on the 26th of November. We are exactly entering now the fourth month, and this is a resolute struggle. You put this together with, you've covered health workers around the world going on strike, and now this
Yeah,
strike in South Africa. I mean, people are fighting back, but
exactly.
there's a lot of killing. I mean, Zoe, I was looking recently, I think from the end of January to now in El Salvador going into election on Sunday for the National Assembly. I think there's been like a series of politicians of the left being killed in this period, these 3 weeks or so. Just these 3 weeks, there's been a series of killings. Nonetheless, it looks like this is going to be quite a contentious election. What's happening in El Salvador, a country, of course, that we pay some attention to because it has a great history of fighting against the constraint on its sovereignty.
That's exactly right. I mean, El Salvador is a relatively pretty small country in Central America, but it's historically had really big importance in the region, and then also in terms of just people's struggle and people's mobilization and kind of being able to fight for this alternative. Of course, with the Frente Farabundo Martí for the Liberación Nacional, FMLN, is the left force that was engaged in armed struggle against dictatorships, was able to defeat the dictatorship and achieve peace agreements in the 90s and give birth to what is a young democracy that is today, as members of the FMLN say, deeply under threat. So, I mean, you spoke about these assassinations. Essentially, and I think the last days of January, there was, of course, elections are being held this Sunday. The FMLN, as well as all the other political parties, have been in campaign, mobilizing, and they were driving back from a campaign caravan, and there was an armed attack on their vehicle, and 2 members of the party were shot. Multiple people were shot. 2 members were killed. It was, of course, later uncovered that the armed assailants, were members of the National Police, were members of the ruling party of Nayib Bukele, and were followers of this. What they're explaining is kind of a discourse of hatred against the left in El Salvador. And so, I spoke to a candidate from the FLN this week, Victor Suazo, who's running for the National Assembly. And it was really interesting, and it's a very challenging situation because, in El Salvador, there have been repeated and concerted attacks on democratic institutions and on kind of the rule of law in the country. So, just a year ago, on February 9th, 2020, right before the pandemic starts, Nayib Bukele, with the support of the armed forces, storms the National Assembly. And I think this was kind of lost as a really, scary and threatening action because, of course, then rapidly after we fall into kind of what is the COVID-19 pandemic. But, for leftist forces in El Salvador, this act of storming the National Assembly and usurping power, briefly, but usurping power from the legislative branch is considered as a coup d'etat, and not a traditional coup d'etat, but of course has to be considered as attack on the institutions. And so for them, that's why these elections and, fighting for control over the democratic institutions, fighting for kind of the recovery of this democracy that is so young and was, fought for with lives in the Civil War, which of course, as a side note, Nayib Bukele has criticized the peace agreements and called them a farce, is of immediate order. And so, they're going to elections on Sunday. The FMLN is making a powerful campaign with a new generation of militants, a new generation of people committed to protecting this democracy and committed to fighting against authoritarianism. And, these are local elections, but of course, they have regional importance, and they have importance in, this global struggle against authoritarianism, against encroaching upon our democratic institutions and, in defense of democracy. So we really have to, keep watch on El Salvador this Sunday and support the people in their defense of this democracy.
I'd just like to say that this is one of the reasons why I always tell people to bookmark peoplesdispatch.org and come on a regular basis to read things, because honestly, friends, where else do you get such a detailed story on El Salvador and its elections. I mean, I thought the interview you conducted, Zoe, was excellent. It brought out the main issues. It brought it out in regional and in national perspective. I mean, I often get so frustrated with the things I read. We opened with the story on the U.S. bombing in Syria. You know, you read CNN, it's comical that we consider ourselves to be part of the same profession. There's something comical in that. Prashant, Al Jazeera has decided to open a new channel, which is to, just sort of go out there and pander to the right wing. And I think, why don't you, Al Jazeera, instead of pandering to the right wing, pander to the profession of journalism? Shouldn't that be, what you're going for? Is pander to journalism, not the right wing? On the other hand, of course, the story of Ahmad Arakat, Al Jazeera has covered that pretty well, and I know that you've been looking at that carefully. June 2020, young man killed. New report out on the killing. Another case of Israeli apartheid violence against Palestinians. A very sad story. This is not somebody without great connections and so on. Prashant, I know that there's a time when we used to rely on Al Jazeera for coverage of the Arab world. Increasingly, I hope people come to People's Dispatch for that coverage. You can't take seriously a channel that says now we want to have a right-wing section. Honestly, there's something bizarre about that. Tell us what the reports are saying now from Forensic Architecture and others about Ahmad Arakat.
Right, it's a really shocking story for multiple reasons, of course, and it's good that actually this kind of a report came out, because Ahmad Arakat was killed in June last year, and it was at a checkpoint near Bethlehem, and it was a huge tragedy because he was actually going to pick up his relatives from a beauty parlor because his sister's wedding was scheduled. His own wedding was scheduled just a couple of weeks from then. A very young man, around in his mid 20s, 27-year-old actually. And the Israelis claimed, of course, that he was going to attack the soldiers, which is, I mean, of course, when you know the story, it's really absurd as well. But the point, of course, is that they cooked up this whole story about how there was a threat to their soldiers, and this was done in self-defense and all that. And the new report by Forensic Architecture has pointed out that it's completely bogus. That there was no acceleration of the car, there was no attempted ramming, an Israeli soldier or anything of that sort. And what they did after that was they shot him, and they left him to bleed for almost an hour. When an ambulance was coming, they didn't allow the ambulance to come, and he died. And what is, in some senses, perhaps even worse, is that his body has still not been returned to his family. It's all close to a year, and his body has not been returned. And again, this is not a unique case, because there are a number of victims of killings like this. I think right now the number is somewhere probably over 60 whose bodies have not been returned. And again, I think last year the number of deaths that were counted of Palestinians being killed was around 27 or something. A large number of them very clearly posing, absolutely no threat at all. And this has been recorded. But nonetheless, Israel has continued with this policy of utter impunity. So there's been no, there have been, in some cases, regret is sometimes expressed. In some cases, that's not even done. And either way, there is often no justice. Before Ahmad Arakat's incident, of course, there was a case of Iyad al-Halak, another tragic case of a Palestinian with autism, similarly killed at a checkpoint because, the soldiers threatened him. He was probably scared. He ran, and they responded by shooting him dead. And this, of course, sparked a huge number of protests. But again and again, we come back to this question of basically Palestinians, I mean, multiple things, of course, that Palestinians leading normal lives, going about their normal lives, being treated in this manner, being shot dead, having to negotiate checkpoints, of course, in their own land, facing, even after that, this kind of indignity, both in terms of being accused of, say, doing these kind of acts, and, not even being, their bodies not even being allowed to, not even being returned to their families for their final rites, and for them to even get the smallest measure of peace. And of course, these are of course individual incidents, but like you said, this is a pattern. The same Israel had denied Palestine Palestinians a vaccine just a couple of weeks, just last week. When the doses came, they sent them back again at the checkpoint. So it's one of the great atrocities, true apartheid of our times, when a young man who's going to pick up his relatives for a wedding is shot and allowed to bleed on the streets for 1 hour. Like you said, he's the nephew of Seb Barakat, who also died last year, a very senior PLO leader. But irrespective of that, the point is same. Iyad al-Halak, Ahmed Rakat, again, very similar instances of young men, young women who were just being killed for being Palestinians. So a lot of demands for the return of the body, of course, for justice, but Israel has continued to be Israel that way. So that's where we are right now.
It's a very grim world we live in. I'm right now in Santiago, in Chile. I spent the day at the big cemetery across the river in Recoleta. There's a section where there's a wall of the disappeared, where there are names of people, and you see fresh. I mean, this is now going back 50 years to the coup, 48 years. There are posters still sitting there, freshly made, put by families. Donde están? Photograph of a kid, 20 years old, disappeared. Somebody said, from your loving brother, from your mother. There's a wall of just forgotten people, sensitive people of the left, trying to make a difference in their society, just taken out. Of course, Ahmed Arakat is not a political person like that, but just being Palestinian is political in a sense, Prashant. As you say, the indignity goes even into death. And of course, we are now sitting with the question of the Honduras, where Berta Caceres, just killed. And what comes of that? Every year that goes by, we look back at that killing of, again, a sensitive person, just like those young Chileans, just like the many Palestinians. Zoe, of course, you look closely at Honduras. You follow the struggles of Copin and others. Tell us a little bit about, one more anniversary, right? One more anniversary.
Yeah, this Tuesday, March 2nd, will mark 5 years since the brutal assassination of Berta Caceres and the attempted assassination of Gustavo Castro, who was, visiting Berta at the time. It's another year has gone by, and another year there's no justice. I think something that has been very clear for Copin in these 5 years of struggle, this case has gotten a lot of international attention. And so Copin has attempted to use this international visibility to draw kind of this larger point about the impunity that exists not only in Honduras, but in Palestine, in Chile, in countries across the world where the elites are able to kill, they're able to disappear, they're able to incarcerate with complete impunity. And I think when we look closely at the case of Berta and her assassination and the events leading up to her assassination, it tells us a lot about the current system that we're living in, the interests behind these murders, these crimes, these horrible atrocities, and kind of what is permitted in this society. And so with the case of Berta, for those of you who don't know, Berta is one of the founders of the Civic Council for Popular and Indigenous Organizations of Honduras. Incredible organization, has fought for the recognition of indigenous people in Honduras, which were previously, ignored institutionally, as in the state did not recognize them. They have won really important victories in terms of gaining rights for these populations. And beginning in 2010, of course, as a direct impact of the coup in Honduras, supported financially, politically, tacitly by the United States. I mean, that's a whole nother can of worms that we won't get into right now. But following the coup, there was, rollout of essentially granting concessions to companies with international financing. And so in the territory which Copin works in Tibuca, in the region of the indigenous Lenca people, there was a concession on the sacred Gualcarque River to build a hydroelectric dam. And so the community there started organizing. Copin, which works with these communities, started organizing as well. They were engaged in a very fierce resistance against this project for the protection of their people and in defense of the land. And this project that they see as an alternative model to this, what they call, a project of death, a project of exploitation, and a project of, disrespect to the people. And so they were engaged in this resistance. members of COPIN, members of the community of Rio Blanco were facing attacks constantly. I mean, Berta was the 6th person that was assassinated in the context of this case, the 6th person. And before her assassination, she was receiving death threats. She was incarcerated several times, detained. She was, being followed, having her phone intercepted. And all of this was in collusion with the state of Honduras. The company DESA, which has the project Aguasarca, has financing from Finland, from the Netherlands, from USAID. And so I think the case of Berta, the fight for justice in the case of Berta is struggling for justice for people across the world who are, eliminated by the forces of capital that want to impose this project and will not allow resistance to be waged. And so this Tuesday, I want us all to remember Berta, her struggle, what she represented, her incredible efforts and actions. And, hopefully she inspires us to continue our struggle and our resistance.
I should say that in April, People's Dispatch, alongside other groups, COPIN and so on, will be putting out the Tricontinental Dossier on Honduras, where we'll emphasize the case of Berta, but also the murders of the Garifuna people. So please look out for that. We'll talk about that when it's out. That'll be out in the first week of April. It's a good place to close out, isn't it? But let's go to Venezuela for a minute. At the People's Dispatch site, Manolo de los Santos and I did a story about the visit by the UN Special Rapporteur on the ill effects, anti-human rights effects of sanctions. Well, Elena Duhan, who's from Belarus, spent 10 days or so in Venezuela, met a range of people, and her preliminary findings are extraordinary. I mean, I highly recommend, go and read Manolo and my article at People's Dispatch if you'd like, but also just go to the Human Rights Council and read the report. It's chilling because she shows how the sanctions against Venezuela are illegal, they're criminal, they have resulted in a high increase in poverty and in suffering of the people. The Venezuelan government since 1999 has attempted to lift social misery. I mean, that over there is an old Bolivarian computer. It was things like this produced in Venezuela, given to people. All of that has faced attrition. And on top of that, of course, the government has had to struggle to meet the basic needs of people. And there's an anti-blockade law that was passed last year. So Manolo and I talked to William Castillo, who's the Vice Minister for the anti-blockade initiatives, and it's a very interesting series of points that William Castillo makes. So I recommend people go and take a look at it. The European Union, after Elena Duhan's report, decided to increase sanctions. It's an interesting thing that after she published the report, there was no real public confirmation of what they thought of it, except the increased sanctions. And then, of course, the Venezuelan government expelled the European Union's ambassador. It's just not a good way for things to happen during a pandemic. It's just not a good way for things to happen. So, go take a look at it. It's quite extraordinary what's happening against Venezuela, but not just Venezuela. It's about 30 countries that face unilateral sanctions. I mean, our show today began with the US bombing on the Syria-Iraq border. It's a lawless bombing because it was done without any dossier provided to the UN or anything. I mean, shouldn't one have to prove or show something before one acts in this way? In the same way, these sanctions against 30 countries are illegal, as Elena Duhan points out, because they don't have the imprimatur of a UN Security Council resolution. That's what the UN Charter requires. They just don't, which makes it illegal. The US bombing in Syria does not have the imprimatur of a US Security Council resolution, which is what makes it illegal. I mean, Prashant, Zoe, the three of us don't use words like illegal as a synonym for immoral or incorrect. I mean, we use the term illegal with the foundation being the US Charter. I think UN Charter. I mean, the UN Charter is the standard of legality as far as I think we are concerned. And I think as far as journalists should That should be a framework. So that's another week gone by. It's a good week for reporters because there's a lot of bad stories. But I must say, one of the things about People's Dispatch and the work we do at Globetrotters, we try to find history in even grim stories, that things move ahead. And I'm encouraging you to go to People's Dispatch, read the website, follow the journalists from Globetrotter. Come back and visit us again next week and give the people what they want. Prashant, all okay?
All good.
Okay there?
Cheers.
Okay. Zoe, you okay?
I'm just glad to be back with you guys.
Well, as you said, the band's back together again.
The band's back together. It feels great. Feels great.
Right.
Okay, see you next time. Bye.
See you
Until next time. Bye-bye.